Kings and Queens, the real lives of the English monarchs, the kings and queens of England, from the House of Wessex to the House of Windsor, explores the lives, loves, triumphs and disasters of a monarchy that is the envy of the world. Peter Snow and Anne MacMillan look at and give a unique insight into those born to rule, whether villains and heroes. Delighted to be joining me live on the line from the UK. Peter Snow and Anne MacMillan, good morning to you both.
Hi.
Hi, Giles.
Good to have you with us. I mean, if you're going to pick a subject to deal with, then the English/British monarchy you certainly got a rich vein, because I mean, all life is contained in there.
You're telling me. I mean, we go back to the best of them all in a way. The sort of the most upright and most man of greatest integrity is probably Alfred the Great. Although Elizabeth II comes a good second. But in between those lot, my goodness gracious me, what a collection of rascals and sort of heroes too we have.
And I mean, it's the thing is, how do you pick a coherent narrative? And there's basically just over 1,000 years of history in there, from Alfred the Great, via William the Conqueror, and then you can pick. I mean, the Plantagenets normally get a bit of a swerve round. We go bowling into the Tudors, and then went to the Elizabethan age, and then we got Regency and Reformation and Victoria. I mean, how on earth do you condense, boil, make a manageable? Because this could have been a tome rather than a manageable book.
Well, like an ant's nest, I think. Anyway, go on.
But, Giles, all life is there. That's what's so fascinating about this. So the houses, although we put them in houses, as you say, Wessex, followed by the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes, and then the Normans, et cetera, but in fact, it's the individuals who really fascinated us. Although some of the houses are quite interesting. For example, the Hanovers. When Queen Anne died, there was no obvious Protestant. We couldn't have a Catholic heir because Catholics were persona non grata in those days. So they looked around, Queen Anne's advisors, because she was pregnant 17 times, had only 5 live births. All of her children died before the age of 11, 3 of them from smallpox. So she had no heir. So her advisors looked around, and they discovered the great grandson of King James I, who was the Elector of Hanover, George. He spoke no English. Once Queen Anne died, he was brought to England for the first time in his life, and then tried to open Parliament by reading one sentence of the speech and then handing it over to his chancellor. I mean, but they were an odd crowd, all the Georges, George 1, 2, 3, 4, because they all hated their sons. They hated their sons and heirs, and they all fought with them. And one observer at the time said, like pigs, the Hanoverians trample their young.
Ooh, that's rather good. But I mean, I'm detecting a slight, if you say, across the pond accent there, and so perhaps George III, you have a soft spot for him, surely.
Well, you see, I'm Canadian.
I know. So I knew. You see, as soon as I said that, I knew it would be Canada.
Royals are royals. No, George III, funnily enough, even though he's the mad king who everybody says lost America, he reigned from 1760 to 1820. He reigned for 60 years. And I developed a soft spot for that guy because he went mad, literally, 4 times. At first, they thought it was something called porphyria, which is a hereditary disease that makes your urine turn blue. But more recently, people think that he probably was bipolar.
Right.
So he really literally went nuts 4 times during his reign. And the first time he tried to strangle his son and heir, George IV. Another time he
wasn't a bad thing to be had.
Yeah, he was pretty awful. Then he also was so rude and horrible to his wife who adored him, that Queen Charlotte, that she took to locking herself in her bedchamber at night just to make sure that he wouldn't attack her. His last 10 years of his life, he went completely mad, and he literally wandered around Windsor Castle in isolation in a tattered purple dressing gown, talking to dead friends. He had long conversations with friends long dead. But in the end, I liked him because he worked so hard. He was a really good king, and he listened to his advisors, and he tried to rule very, very well. And it was unfortunate that the Americans rose up and beat the Brits during his reign, but he was a good guy.
I mean, when it comes, there's been an awful lot of sort of people being enthused about houses and medieval and a bit of sword play going on because of, you know, one or two HBO series, you know, sort of Game of Thrones type of thing. And when you look at the line of houses and Plantagenets and early Middle Ages, and we mentioned the House of Wessex, and some people might think that's, you know, Prince Edward, but it goes back far longer than that, with the greatest of respect to Edward and Sophie. But, you know, there really is, there are things that happen people refer to it as the late Dark Ages. It wasn't particularly dark. It's just that we didn't know that much about it. And the you know, the battles and the conquests and people getting arrows in various parts of their anatomy. I mean, it really is it's a fascinating and bloody period of history. But B, how did you research it, Peter? How did you? I mean, do you have a grounding this before, and then you think, okay, I'm going to, with the greatest of respect, bolt on a bit more knowledge on this bit, or how do you approach it, especially when you're looking at those more obscure, shall we say, less well documented periods of history?
Yeah, the more obscure ones are rather difficult to get at sometimes. Certainly some of the older ones, the Anglo-Saxons and so on. But there's always, throughout the period we were studying, I mean, 1,200 years since Alfred the Great in 870 odd, there's always some kind of chronicler. The chroniclers tend to be rather flattering at most of the time in the early years. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Bishop Asser, who was the biographer of Alfred the Great, they tended to say what a good chap he was. But I think he generally was a good chap. I mean, you only got to look at his actions to see what a fine chap he was. Anyway, certainly there's always a chronicler around who will give you an idea of what happened. There's a bit of archaeology, of course. I mean, for example, the princes in the Tower, the princes who died in the Tower. There's a bit of archaeology that suggests that their skeletons may have been dug up, that proving that they were killed in the Tower and were buried in the Tower, or maybe just died of poisoning or something. So there's a lot of evidence around. It's not too bad, and we found it fascinating. Incidentally, talking about dynasties, you mentioned, some of the rascals we've had. I think probably the worst dynasty was the Stuarts. I mean, I think if you go from James I through Charles and James II, it's hard to find a good king amongst that lot. When you get to the end of it, William III, of course, great chap, and Queen Anne was a very successful queen. But the early Stuarts, that was really the depths.
Well, I mean, it did spark a civil war in the UK. We didn't just want to do that sort of thing, and plunged us into a decade of Puritanism. It's interesting you mentioned the princes in the Tower, because if you go back to schoolboy history, we were always taught, princes in the Tower, nasty uncle, nasty father, whatever. But of course, a lot of that is revisionist, because it was being rewritten, if you like, in a Victorian kind of way. If you look back at that history of Britain that was written in the Victorian era. So you've got to sort of cut through some of the Victorian, and here we go, fake news. I thought I'd drop that in for you, to find out sort of the real stuff, because we do have, because as the saying goes, history is written by the victors, Danes notwithstanding. Anne.
Well, it's interesting you should talk about Richard III, who allegedly arranged for the princes to be murdered in the Tower, because our son, Dan Snow, who's a real historian, a reputable historian, it's his profession, he actually wrote the foreword to our book, but he said, you've got to be careful, to Peter, who was writing about Richard III. You can't just say he was a terrible man. That was Shakespeare's fault. And so you did actually have some sympathy, didn't you, Peter, with Richard III?
Yes, I mean, he was a very brave man, no question about that. He was very helpful to his brother Edward IV. When he was king, he was very loyal to him. It's only when he became, when he was faced with the problem that Edward had a son called Edward V, became King Edward V when his father died. It was only when that happened that the uncle, as you rightly say, the good old Uncle Richard III, thought, hang on, this chap can't be king. He's far too young, and I should be king. I'm a much better fellow than he is. And determined to get rid of him. And he kept cancelling the coronation, his nephew's coronation. And eventually he started making out that his nephew wasn't really legitimate. So the evidence suggests, I'm afraid, that Richard III wasn't that impressive a chap in terms of goodness, that he really probably was responsible for the killing of his nephews. I mean, I'm afraid I'm rather macho about that. I think that Richard wasn't a good man.
It's an interesting way, just sort of family dynamic, which I hadn't realised before, of course, because, with Dan being a historian, and I've had the pleasure of interviewing Dan, and I've read the Crusaders book, which is an absolute tome and a half, and I loved every page of it. But therefore, do you actually have these family conversations where saying, well, say Richard Coeur de Lion, you see, he wasn't a great king for the England because he was always off sort of having a bash at Saladin, for example?
Yes. No. The answer is we talk to Dan a lot. He's a great chap. He wrote the foreword, and we have great sort of not battles with Dan, but great debates with Dan. He's a wonderful chap. He's far cleverer than we are, but he's a wonderful historian. Richard I, hang on, said a minute. He was his downside was that he spent so much time crusading and bashing up, as you say, trying to bash up without success, Saladin, that didn't spend enough time in England, which is true. He didn't. The trouble was he ran into the problem with his younger brother, John, who was an extremely vicious fellow, started to try to rebel against his brother, Richard, when Richard was out in the Holy Land. So we didn't like John very much, but Richard, he was crusading, true. He came back and found the place was a bit of a mess because his brother was causing trouble. But he put it right, and he was very kind to his brother, actually, forgave him. So Richard, I think, was a good man.
He was only king for 10 years. It's hard to believe that. But the other thing about that is the Normans, for example. Most of them, William I, William II, Henry I, and Stephen, most of them spent little time in England as it was in those days. They were all fighting the whole time. All the neighbors, the Norman neighbors in sort of Brittany and France, and they really spent much less time in England, most of them, than they did abroad.
Well, if you look at it, if you have like the Normans, they had Sicily. So, given the chance between spending time in Stockport with the greatest respect to Stockport, or Sicily, or Peckham or Palermo, I think that you'd want to spend more time in the Mediterranean climes, surely.
Yeah, there was more fun there, I think.
One of the things about British monarchies is the role that queens have played. Because if you look back, and I know that we've had a year of reflection, but the British monarchy seems to have had some outstanding, if you look at the way that the monarchy has gone, some outstanding female leaders. And by right, we shouldn't have had that many, but those, the first Elizabethan age, Queen Victoria, and obviously the second Elizabethan age, as you can call it, with the recently departed Queen. We've had and Queen Anne as well. We've had some pretty impressive female monarchs.
You're quite right about that. I'm glad to say, because I was fascinated by the female monarchs, obviously, and they were very, very good.
There's one exception. Hang on a minute. We can't let Bloody Mary off the platform. She was appalling. And she dragged them all down, I'm afraid. She drags all the females down with her, suggesting that women are just as capable of being really vicious as men are.
How many people did she have? How many Catholics did she have?
Something like 250. Yeah. It was awful.
Yeah. But anyway, you're right. The women do stand out. Queen Anne, as I've mentioned, had a terribly difficult personal life. I love the story about her husband. She had a very loyal husband who was the Prince of Denmark. And Charles the First, her uncle, said at one point he was known to be the most boring man in England. But Anne adored him, and he was a great leveler for her. But Charles the First, her uncle, once said, "I've tried him drunk, and I've tried him sober, and there's nothing to him."
I just like the title of the most boring man in England. Like, there could be a competition. Forget the X Factor and Celebrity Eye and Get Me Out of Here. I think to have the most boring man in England on TV would be quite a crowd pleaser. If we look at 20th century monarchs as well, people might say, oh, well, the monarchy has no relevance, but my goodness, the abdication is George V, George IV, indeed. Some of the monarchs that are perhaps often overlooked in the 20th century. But in that early part, there was constitutional crisis. We've had revolution, and we've obviously in the age of enlightenment, monarchs were being deposed left, right, and centre. So why do you think that the monarchy had a relevance, and why do you think the British monarchy survived in an age of revolution and now in an age of internet and social media and TikTok, and yet people still feel a connection in the UK with the monarchs?
Yeah. It is quite extraordinary. You're absolutely right. sensible person looking at this, one of the world's oldest democracies, and not quite, of course, the Athenians beat us, but looking at one of the world's oldest democracies, I mean, here we are still having this extraordinary hereditary succession. It doesn't make any rational sense. On the other hand, look at the last few months. We've had a succession of prime ministers on sort of political warfare of the most intense kind. Well, the sovereign has gracefully and serenely succeeded his mother, and it's really looked rather calm and sensible in comparison. And I think the thing I would say is that what the monarchy has done throughout, although it's had some terrible upsets and some ridiculous people, which is like half the fun of it in a way. I mean, the fun thing about the monarchy is the wonderful source of gossip and fun and also tradition, pomp, ceremony, historical continuity. But I think what the hereditary monarchy does, it provides a sort of mantle of stability and continuity under which the politicians can shout at each other as loud as they like. That the Britishness somehow sort of sits there like a kind of umbrella on top of the political turmoil that goes on underneath it. You don't get fights for who's going to be president and all this sort of stuff as you get in America and so on. You get the monarchy going on, drifting along with all its ups and downs, its flaws, and its flawed people. No question about that. Many of them very flawed. But it goes on, and underneath it, the political turmoil can go on.
And during the recent passing of Her Majesty and then the accession of King Charles III, and it still seems a little strange to be saying that, even though there was if you like a warm blanket of that pomp, of that circumstance, of the heralds, because in a world that is topsy-turvy at the best of times, there is something stable about the monarchy and those institutions that people like to cling on to.
You're quite right. And I think particularly Queen Elizabeth, the late Queen Elizabeth, who was with us for so long, most of our lives, we have had her amazing presence. And, the fact that she actually was above politics, she was terribly careful never to say anything that could be misconstrued to be representing her points of view. She was actually, this is really going to be, I might get my head chopped off for this, but when I researched her.
Well, it's Wednesday,
She was actually quite boring, but she wasn't a very interesting human being in many ways, but she just provided this fantastic grace and dedication, her sense of duty, and she just didn't put many feet wrong. She did perhaps with her family life, but certainly not in public.
So what do you hope that people will discover? Do you think they will have a greater understanding of this incredible lineage, this progression that with a couple of bumps in the road, but it has been with a part of British fabric of the society for over 1,000 years. What do you hope that people discover from and learn from your book, Kings and Queens?
I think the important thing they'll discover is, one, that the continuity and stability has provided this sort of cloak I talked about before, and that in a sense, and then most of history has been really quite successful in providing this sort of cover for what goes on underneath. But secondly, that if we think the current royal family is flawed, it has some awkward characters, by Jove, there have been some in the past. One could spend the next 2 hours talking about a lot of terrible scoundrels in the past. I mean, goodness knows. I mean, one king, for example, one Anglo-Saxon king called Eadwig, wonderful word, Eadwig, sounds a bit like earwig. He was only king for a very short time.
1 year.
One year, but he had to be dragged to his coronation banquet by the Archbishop of Canterbury, who felt that he wasn't right that he should be oversleeping. So the Archbishop of Canterbury went to his bedroom, went to the king's bedroom and said, "Hang on, Your Majesty." And, "Oh, hey, what are you up to?" And he was in bed, this guy, you're having a threesome with his cousin and her mother. So,
marvelous. I mean, that's what we miss from modern British monarchy. You see, the Archbishop of Canterbury dragging the monarch down towards his coronation.
That's right. So lots of examples like that.
But the other thing I felt very strongly as I did all my research and wrote this book with Peter is that in spite of their exalted position and their many houses and their servants and their wonderful clothes and their money and art and everything else, these monarchs are just like us. They have the same problems. They have illnesses. They have family problems. They have to deal with human frailties in very much the same way we do, and that I thought was fascinating.
Well, I'm just about to go off and forget about Athelred the Unready. It sounds like Eadwig the Always Ready, and so I will be researching him after this interview. If people want to find more information about yourselves or about the book, where can they go? Is there a website? Is there some sort of social media? Where can they track you down in the nicest possible way?
Well, they can go to our publishers, Welbeck Publishers. Peter has a Twitter account, and so do I, but we don't really use it very much, so that's not much use.
Probably the best part.
Amazon, Waterstones, if you're in Britain, it's all there.
And you'll be able to also...
Yeah, Black Rose Hive and all the other bookstores. Yep.
Marvellous. And you'll also be able to download it from our own virtual bookstore. This book is called Kings and Queens, The Real Lives of the English Monarchs. I'm off to Google Earwig, or whatever his name was. Peter Snow and Anne MacMillan, it's been a real pleasure to speak to you today.
Thanks very much.
Cheers, Giles.